Afternoon. I'm Anthony Painter. I'm Director of Institutional Reform here at the RSA. I'm delighted to welcome you all to today's special lunchtime talk. Just before we begin, can I ask you to make sure your mobile phones are switched to silent? We're reordering your choice architecture already, you see. We're filming today and live streaming over the web, so welcome to all those tuning in online. And a reminder, the hashtag is hashtag RSA Nudge. If you want to get involved in a discussion on Twitter. Housekeeping notices over. It really is my very great pleasure to introduce this afternoon's distinguished guest speaker, Professor Cass Sunstein. Professor Sunstein is an internationally renowned legal scholar and currently the Robert Walmsley University Professor at Harvard. He's founder and director of the program on behavioral economics and public policy at the Harvard Law School, and from 2009 to 2012, he was administrator of the White House Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs. He's the author of many articles and books, including Republic.com, Risk and Reason, and the highly influential Nudge, Improving Decisions About Health, Wealth, and Happiness, which you all will have heard of and no doubt read. However, his very highest accolade comes from the right-wing pundit Glenn Beck, who described him as the most dangerous man in America. He joins us today to share some of his thinking from his latest book, Why Nudge? The Politics of Libertarian Paternalism, in which he builds an ethical as well as a political case for the legitimacy and purpose of governments intervening in the way that we choose. Professor Sunstein will speak for about 25 minutes. I'll have a brief conversation with him. We'll then open it out to you, and we'll aim to wrap it up by 2 o'clock. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Cass Sunstein.
Thank you so much, and thanks for hosting me. It's a real honor. When Glenn Beck called me the most dangerous man in America, I had hoped, that this was a reference to my ability on the squash court. I'm an avid squash player. I did have my professional squash debut within the last week, and it did not go very well. I played a 20-year-old from Pakistan, and I'm not the most dangerous man, at least on the squash court, sorry to say. Okay, so these are going to be remarks at the intersection of the topic of why nudge and the value of choice. So the topic is choice and its place in human life. And there's going to be an ambivalent relationship here between my remarks and the great essay of John Stuart Mill on liberty. So in some ways, Mill is the hero of these remarks, but he's certainly the interlocutor, and there's going to be an ambivalent attitude toward Mill. So the idea of nudging, which as you'll recall, is has as its goal preserving freedom of choice while also nudging people in a direction that makes their lives go well. The idea of nudging is designed emphatically to preserve human liberty. But there are a few things that might be said that are skeptical of the project. One is whether nudges are sufficiently respectful of autonomy, or whether there might not be an autonomy-infringing dimension to nudges. Another has to do with human dignity, with the sense that there's a risk. Some skeptics fear that people will be treated as children rather than adults. And there's also a question about the value of learning. If people are nudged, it might be wondered, are they able to build up a kind of capital stock in their own minds of capacities, or will they passively go about their lives in a way that's comfortable maybe, but not sufficient for building up knowledge that can enable them to govern themselves? Okay, it is true that nudges are everywhere, whether we like them or not. On cold days, people are more likely to buy products, goods that they will return when it gets warmer. Weather is emphatically a nudge. A website nudges, so does a cafeteria. We know that human beings are not irrational. That would be quite a charge and not a fair one, but they are subject to persistent biases. But even if that's true, the concerns about autonomy and dignity are fair, and they deserve a thorough response. Okay, with respect to the value of choice and its place in human life, we need to anchor in some examples. So organ donation is a famous one, where people might be asked to make an active choice whether they want to be organ donors, or they might be subject to an opt-in or opt-out system. All over the world, nations are interested in providing greener sources of energy. Consumers are a big part of the energy mix. Are you actively choosing what energy provider you have, or do you have one by default? That poses a question about the presence of choice. When you turn on your computer or visit a website, do you make an active choice about privacy, or is it instead presumed one way or the other? With respect to retirement plans and healthcare plans, there's a pervasive decision whether to have an opt-in approach, or instead something that says, what do you want? Okay, here's a picture of the human condition where there are choices everywhere. I did not draw this picture, but it does capture the thesis of these remarks. These people are facing questions everywhere, and if wherever you look there's a question, then the risk is that your cognitive capacity will be overloaded. And that, I think, is immediately a question for John Stuart Mill, who prizes rightly the value of choice. If choices are made everywhere we turn, then we're not going to be turning in many places because we will be stuck in one or two. Okay, the problem I'm going to highlight is that people often choose not to choose, or would if they were asked, and this can be rational. In fact, it can be more rational sometimes to choose not to choose than to choose in circumstances in which we have limited bandwidth. So if you've ever really appreciated the following blessed suggestion on a website, do not ask me again. If you've ever seen that and smiled and checked, then you will be on to the point. If you've ever had a friend or an organization who asks you repeatedly, what do you want with respect to lunch or vacation or activity, and found that friend or institution a little bit irritating, then the point is, I think, probably transparent. What I'm going to be suggesting is that it's a form of paternalism to override people's choices, including their choices not to choose. And in circumstances in which people have a judgment that they would like not to choose, then we are witnessing paternalism when that choice is itself influenced or overridden. Okay, I'm going to make a set of claims. They're going to be a bit abstract, for which please forgive me. I'll try to specify them with some examples. And the claims are about the following option, either for each of us in our individual lives or for institutions with which we interact. And the options are basically three: whether there's going to be active choosing, where each of us selects, whether there's going to be a default rule of the impersonal variety in the sense that applies to a broad swath of the population, for example, all employees of a large organization or all citizens of a locality. That's an impersonal default rule. Or third, a personalized default rule where an institution, like a friend, decides what is a default rule that suits you in particular. That's a personalized default rule. So in ordinary life, friends and family members, whether the question involves lunch or a conversation topic or a vacation spot or activity over the weekend, chooses often a personalized default, saying this is what we think or I think you will like, subject to override. A personalized default in the institutional setting is a close analog, which is in some sense, I think, alarming, that an institution would know enough about you to choose a personalized default for you. But in some sense, it could be a great blessing if there's reason for trust in the institution. Okay, my first claim is that the impersonal default rule, notwithstanding one reading of the liberal tradition, is better than active choosing. So the default rule is better than active choosing. When the context is confusing and unfamiliar, when people would prefer not to choose, when learning doesn't matter much, and when the population isn't heterogeneous along any relevant dimension. So those are the circumstances where an impersonal default rule is really good, so that your employer or your educational institution or your government offers you a default rule and says you can have this. If you don't want it, you can opt out. Freedom is preserved, but this is the status quo unless you make a particular decision. The qualification to this idea is that we need to be able to trust choice architects to produce sensible default rules. If their rules are harmful or dumb, we should insist on active choosing. Okay, second claim. Active choosing is better than an impersonal default rule when choice architects are biased or lack important information. That may be public officials. It may be the University of X. It might be a big company. When the context is familiar, so people don't say, please don't bother me with this, and say instead, I understand it, and it's not a bother. When people would actually prefer to choose, so choice is a benefit rather than a cost, when learning matters, and when there's relevant heterogeneity. I want to underline the point about where learning matters. There are many areas where active choosing is crucial because it helps people develop a kind of understanding and knowledge base that can enable them to embark on enterprises of their own in the future. Now, we don't want to get, I don't think, theological about this point about learning. There are many domains where learning is more important in the abstract than on the ground, so that when writing first developed, some skeptics, prominent skeptics, said this is very bad because people will stop memorizing texts. And that was a fair point. We memorize text less when we have writing, but that's not a convincing, all things considered, objection to writing. It's good that there be writing, even if the ability to memorize is diminished as a result. So we don't want to take the point about learning excessively, but it's nonetheless important in many areas. Okay, the third claim is that personalized default rules, which look a bit science fictional, admittedly, are better than impersonal ones in the face of relevant heterogeneity. So an enduring objection to a default rule, whether we're talking about retirement plans or healthcare or energy, is that one size doesn't fit all. And if that's the case, then we want personalized default rules that suit you. For retirement plans at, let's say, large employers, a default setting is not a bad idea, but someone who's 25 should have a different default setting from someone who's 65. Someone who's in good health might want a different default plan from someone who's in poor health. And that suggests personalization is a great boon. Okay, the fourth and final claim is that personalized defaults have big advantages over active choosing because they produce benefits in terms of accuracy without requiring people to devote the time and effort to making the choice. So the beauty of the personalized default is that it escapes the crudeness and generality of the impersonal default, which is why personalized defaults are coming. And they also don't require people to devote their limited time and attention to what they might not care about. If choice architects are informed and trustworthy, and if safeguards are in place to protect personal privacy, then there's a strong argument for the personalized default rule. This is meant as a response to the objection from the standpoint of autonomy by saying that autonomous people like this because it fits their circumstances. It allows them to opt out, and it acknowledges that in circumstances in which learning is important, then the case for active choosing ends up being strong enough. Okay, with respect to my claim about the paternalistic character of requiring choosing, what I want to say against those who are concerned about the paternalistic character of default rules as nudges is that to require active choosing in circumstances in which people don't want that is itself a form of paternalism, so that choice requiring paternalism is no oxymoron. If people are busy, confused, unhappy about the idea of taking responsibility in areas where they don't feel themselves competent, not because they're generally incompetent, but because this is not an area that interests or focuses them, then to require them to make an active choice is a form of nannyism. This is in the nature of a tu quoque argument, you too, as against those who prize active choosing. If we take John Stuart Mill's basic arguments against paternalistic intervention, his famous harm principle, the core for Mill is a welfare argument that choosers know a lot better about their individual circumstances than outsiders. That's a forceful point, which is often convincing. It applies also to people who make a choice not to choose or would make exactly that choice if asked. They know best whether this is a circumstance in which their welfare would be promoted by active choosing. And by hypothesis, they've decided not. To concretize, at my own university, when people join, they're defaulted into a retirement plan. I don't have the data, but I'm pretty confident the number of people who make an active choice to override the default retirement plan is really low. And what the university is picking up on is if you ask people who join the university to make a particular choice about their own preferred retirement plan, the welfare of those employees would go down. Say, we want to think about our work, our families, the newspaper, not about the complexities of a retirement plan. Most people. If active choosing were required, it would be a form of paternalism. Many people who believe that Mill is deeply right are not welfarists. Their goal is to preserve individual autonomy, and they think that people have a right to make choices, even if those choices would diminish their welfare, that that's part of what respect for persons entails. If we think that, we ought to be enthusiastic about respect for the choice not to choose as well, oughtn't we? That's an exercise of autonomy. When people choose not to choose on the ground that this is an area that they'd prefer not to become expert in, to override that choice is itself paternalistic. So what I'm insisting here is that active choosing as a requirement is itself an interference with people's welfare and their autonomy. Now, to know whether it is, we need to know whether people choose to choose, but often they don't. Okay, it must be acknowledged that there are some cases in which the argument I've given won't work, and those are cases where the choice not to choose is an alienation of freedom. In the extreme case, people are, voluntarily becoming slaves. In less extreme cases, people are alienating their right to vote. They're choosing not to choose with respect to vote. Or in a case which, at least in many cultures, would be deemed similar, they are alienating their decisions about whom they're going to marry. In cases that involve defining choices or intimate choices of this kind, we might think that autonomy or welfare itself contains a barrier against alienation of the right to choose. That's a fair point, but it's only a subset of the cases where people choose not to choose. It's not the category itself, and it should be split off as an important subset. Okay, what can be said for active choosing? Well, Brave New World has a hero named the Savage, kind of ironic, kind of meant, where the Savage says, I don't want comfort, I want God, I want poetry, I want real danger, I want freedom, I want goodness, I want sin. That's a plea for active choosing in circumstances in which it might diminish our well-being in some narrow sense. And in cases in which choice architects aren't good, or in which there's diversity in the population, or in which people's preferences change over time, the Huxley argument for active choosing, which I think is implicit in Brave New World, is very powerful. But let's see what might be said on the other side. There's a passage, an oral passage actually, from MIT economist Esther Duflo, speaking about poverty, and I'm going to try to generalize that argument as a qualification of Huxley's plea for active choosing. What Duflo says orally is we tend to be patronizing about the poor in a very specific sense, which is we tend to think, why don't they take more responsibility for their lives? What we are forgetting is the richer you are, the less responsibility you need to take for your own life because everything is taken care of for you. And the poorer you are, the more you have to be responsible for everything about your life. Stop berating people for not being responsible and start to think of ways instead of providing the poor with the luxury everyone else has. If we do nothing, we are on the right track. For most of the poor, if they do nothing, they are on the wrong track. Okay, that's a suggestion that in a world pervaded by active choosing, and it would be easy to devise a kind of Brave New World mirror image where this is also a nightmare scenario. There's a trilogy of concerns. First is burdens on choosers who can't allocate their time to what most concerns them. Second is on burdens on planners and producers who can't go about their lives providing goods and services because they have to ask people at every stage, what do you want with respect to this? Like your setting on your cell phone, your setting on your computer, your settings on your energy provider. And there's a risk of errors, meaning that if we required active choosing for people who aren't specialists, they'd make their own lives go worse. And that's why often people choose not to choose. Okay, a political wrinkle is that a system of default voting where people could go online at any time, I'm making this up, to partyvote.gov and say they want to vote for one or another party in the coming election. Imagine default voting, where people voluntarily enroll in a system from which they will henceforth not have to choose. My own experiments suggest overwhelming rejection of default voting. And that suggests a qualification to the argument I've given so far, pointing to the relationship between active choosing and citizenship, which probably belongs in the same category as defining or intimate choices, where the alienation is an alienation of freedom. At the same time, a national representative survey that I've done finds ambivalent results on the question whether people like an algorithm in which they are enrolled in a system of predictive shopping, where an algorithm knows what kinds of books they want and mails them books. Most people reject, 59%, but 41% say that's okay. What's noteworthy about that result is that most people want to make their own choices and would decline to enroll, but 41% would sign up. Okay, I think what that is suggesting is that at least for certain categories of purchases, a majority now doesn't even want a reliable algorithm. They believe in active choosing, but 41% are okay with it, thinking if they get the books they want by algorithm, that's fine. I think at this point I'm going to stop and just make a couple general remarks. Why choosing not to choose can be rational and honorable and good for welfare and good for freedom is closely associated with just one thing, which is the most precious commodity the human race has. There's one. It's the most precious. Time. Thanks.
Thank you. We have a fair amount of time, but not an abundant amount. I just want to come back to some of the philosophical underpinnings, and I want to come back to this notion of autonomy. And you've used this word paternalism, and it seems to me that you might almost be making it deliberately hard on yourself to make the case, because it seems to me that the autonomists, or the automatons, whatever you want to call it, are ignoring the fact that actually we're entirely bounded in our choices. We're bounded by our psychology, we're bounded by culture, society, institutions. And your argument at its best seems to be one of intervening on behalf of the more reflective parts of our cognition against the more reflexive part. So you give System 2, in Daniel Kahneman's terms, a chance. So actually, are you de-infantilizing us by making that intervention? And is that really a paternalist intervention in that sense?
Well, I think there's public relations and then there's analysis. And if the goal were to have kind of perfect public relations, then probably the word paternalism would drop out and we'd go in the direction you're suggesting. But I think in terms of analysis, that would be making things unfairly easy, self-servingly easy. So if you have someone, let's suppose, who really enjoys smoking cigarettes, and let's suppose they enjoy smoking cigarettes more precisely because they don't enjoy not smoking cigarettes, they're addicts. If we take steps, even if they're freedom-preserving steps, to reduce their consumption, to say that's not paternalistic, I think, is a self-serving shorthand. It is paternalistic along one dimension. Their revealed preference is to buy the cigarette. It might be fair, and I think in this case it is completely fair, to say that for at least a certain percentage of smokers, their system one wishes they hadn't gotten involved with cigarettes. And so it is fair to say we're strengthening the hand of system two. To pretermit that kind of complicated thing by saying it's not paternalistic, let's say to take pretty aggressive steps to reduce smoking, is to put a halo and a shiny sun next to one's own conclusion. And maybe fairer not to do that.
Okay. I'm glad you brought up the smoking example, because I think it's interesting. A lot of the examples that you deploy and analyse from a paternalistic standpoint within the book, actually there is a harm principle explanation available to us as well. Now, in that particular example, you make the intervention because ultimately people are concerned about smokers free riding on the system. And if people are concerned about people free riding on the system, that diminishes their support for a system and diminishes the likelihood that they are to support that. I think the Affordable Care Act in America, part of it was ensuring that there was proper healthcare coverage to stop some of the free riding on public healthcare systems, for example. And so you start to undermine the institutions that can spread welfare around. So there is a harm principle analysis is available as well. And I just wonder how many of the examples there isn't really a harm principle analysis that sits very snugly alongside the nudge paternalistic libertarian analysis.
Okay, so suppose we agree with Mill and we have a harm principle. You might think with smoking the most direct harm is the harm to non-smokers who get irritated or sick as a result of smoking. Yeah. And that's probably, supposing the data come out a certain way, secure within the Mill framework. The second kind of harm is the economic harm that people are going to pay for smokers face. Now, that I think we have to be doubly careful with. First, there's an empirical question whether people who pay for, let's say, medical help for others are on net winners or losers by virtue of the existence of smokers. And that's an empirical question. It's not self-evident what the answer is because there's some data, and this is kind of gruesome data, but suggesting because smokers die young, that the taxpayers or funders are on balance better off. Now, I don't want to endorse that data, but suggest that the reason I don't want to endorse it is because I don't know that it's true. Yeah. But if we're in the Mill framework, it's crucial to know the answer to that. Yeah. And the second problem with this kind of harm to others is it has a bootstrapping quality, doesn't it? It's not clear we want to say that by virtue of the existence of welfare and other systems that people who believe rigorously in the harm principle probably don't endorse in the first place, that those principles turn out on harm to others grounds to justify the interventions. So at least there's a question there. So, but I'm going to get to the more fundamental point now. If the problem is harm to others, then the right response, the standard prescription, is a corrective tax. So if smokers, the reason to regulate smoking is they inflict harm to others, then what we should do is have an externality internalizing tax on smokers. And in my view, that's not an adequate response to the problem of smoking is, which is that smokers die young. And so the fundamental concern for those of us who are concerned about the hundreds of thousands of people who die in the United States alone every year from smoking, the fundamental concern is not the rest of us have to pay for them. It's not that the secondhand smoke poses a risk. That's hundreds of thousands of human beings who die young. Yeah. And so I want to bite the million bullet and say that that's a public interest issue especially in view of the behavioral biases which are very much at work in the smoking area.
Okay. Now, another major issue which you touch on in the book is the issue of trust and legitimacy, which I think are fundamental issues. And they raise questions not just about whether to nudge or intervene in some respect, but how you go about it and how transparent you are about it. And there was a case earlier on this year where Facebook had undertaken an exercise to investigate how manipulating its newsfeed in different ways could alter the moods of the people who use Facebook. And conceivably, a government could decide to operate in a similar fashion. Now, what happened at that moment, of course, was there was a huge outrage and an undermining of trust in Facebook as an institution. Now, do we face, as public policy instigators, the same sorts of risks? And then does that not make it incumbent upon us, if we are going to intervene in certain ways, we're exceedingly transparent about it? I think the example you gave on active citizenship and voting probably underpins this point. People expect to be active participants in the public policy decisions that are made on their behalf.
It's a great question, and there's a lot to it. So, okay, first question. Some people think that there's a pervasive issue, which is whether to nudge. And you said that. I think that's in the grip of a picture of institutional life, which is just it's like an Escher drawing. It's not possible, right? Like the hands that turn into the same hand. Escher did that. The government can't say we're not going to nudge. If it has a website, it's nudging. If it has offices, it's nudging. If it has paperwork, it's nudging. If it has a police force, it's nudging. So it can't. That's not a logically possible program. A government could say, I think, we're going to nudge only in circumstances in which nudging is an unavoidable part of what we're doing. That is possible. The issue of trust is very important, as you say. The best way to get trust is to earn trust. And there are two ways you can earn trust. One is by having programs that work, and the other is by not hiding anything. And so it's incumbent on any government, whether it's a mandating, controlling government, which in free societies should not be the preferred path, or a nudging government, that it be transparent about what it's doing, and that it be working every minute of every day to deliver results that people trust. So the antonym to nudging, as I see it, is mandates. Yeah. And those are more worrisome than nudges because they eliminate freedom of choice. But we do have criminal law. That's a mandate. And in the area of environmental protection and education, there are plenty of mandates. And those have to be trusted too. So there's nothing unique about nudging that calls for trust. That's true of everything people privileged to serve a public have to focus on.
Yeah. I just want to go back to the beginning of your talk where you talked about personalizing defaults, because I think it's really interesting, because I wonder whether there's about to be a shift in that domain. I mean, the closer you are to people, the easier it is to personalize their default. Your friends, your family, your teacher, your doctor may well personalize your default because they know you as a patient, a student, a friend, whatever it may be. We are about to we are acquiring the ability to amass huge hordes of data of all sorts of behaviors on all sorts of levels. Does that change the game in terms of personalizing defaults? And should we be concerned about that?
It does change things, doesn't it? And it's connected with trust. My travel website can't possibly know me in the way that a friend can, at least at present, because it doesn't have emotional intelligence.
No.
But it knows my travel preferences better than anybody. It really knows.
And those of people like you.
And those of people like me. Amazon.com is really good at knowing what books I will like. Maybe better than anyone I know. Amazon is really good at knowing what books I like. So if we're concerned about accuracy, even an algorithm with which you interact all the time might well know you in the relevant sphere better than any person. Now, that is, along one dimension, troublesome if you don't want the world to know. The fact that I like behavioral economics books is probably not that surprising, and I'm not that embarrassed about it. But some people, with respect to their book purchases or their clothing preferences, well, clothing kind of visible, but they might not want the world to know. So there's a privacy issue. But I think we are coming to a time, and this is mostly good, though it has to be watched, where institutions with whom you interact will know, with respect to commodities and services at least, your preference is better, conceivably, even than you do. And that can make life better, because you get what you want, and also freer, because you don't have to worry about those things. Household goods, for example, or taxis. You might not have to worry about them as much because they're there.
Good, okay. I think on that note, we're going to open it out. Privacy, trust, choice, legitimacy, freedom. These are pretty big themes. So over to the audience. And we'll take them in banks of 3, I think, and then we'll take them round by round. So, first question. Yes, please, in the centre here. If you can give your name and your question, we've got a roving mic as well.
Tony Hockley from the LSE. It occurred to me that you might not be shy about using the word paternalism, because actually your tests might be tougher tests than the harm principle, because as the world's become more interconnected, almost every aspect of our behaviour affects third parties. And one of the things that I noticed was in experimenting with nudges, one of the things the government sought was to try and get people to pay their tax on time, experimenting with different letters. And one of the letters they tried was, if you don't pay your tax on time, it harms public services. I'm not sure that's true, but they tried that. And actually, the bigger the welfare state, the more you can lay that claim that it harms public services. So actually, the harm principle would lead you to a bigger and bigger state in that effect, and bigger excuse for intervention. Actually, your tests on when it's right to withdraw choice would be a tougher test than the harm principle in the modern world.
Good, thank you. I'm going to go to this gentleman here, please.
Thank you. The point about a machine, an algorithm, or a company knowing more about you than you may know yourself, isn't there a risk, though, that you get to predetermine things on things you like, and you miss out the opportunity for serendipity or chance to put an alternative view or something you hadn't considered, which may take you in a different direction that's more beneficial?
Okay, thank you very much. And the third question, this gentleman here.
Mark Atherton, I'm a fellow here. Given the Facebook experiment, and given what Bob Cialdini said here a couple of weeks ago about every organisation and corporation needing a chief persuasion officer, outside of government, do you see any basis for oversight of the deployment of this kind of technology in corporations where their primary motive is not your welfare, but their profitability?
Okay, great, thank you. So the harm principle more expansive, serendipity and oversight of deployment.
Okay, great question. So serendipity, I completely agree. So there's a book by Jane Jacobs called The Life and Death of the Great American Cities, that's roughly the title, which is one of the great books of the last 100 years. And what it opposes is an architecture of serendipity, which it says a great city has, where you encounter something on a walk that can change your day and your life, and an architecture of control where you're in a self-selected world that's just your own choices. I completely agree. And the point about learning is a qualification to the celebration of personalized default rules. And if we're talking about a world of communications, I completely am with you about the value of serendipity. Okay, so on the third-party question, it is true that third-party effects, harm principle thinking, is sometimes built up into a license for a lot of government activity. I wonder whether some of those arguments aren't sloppy, in the sense that what's driving the person is they want the underlying activity to be reduced or stopped or something, and the third-party effect is like a happy convenience, notwithstanding how its magnitude or reality. So the idea that third-party effects typically justify bigger and bigger government, that should be based on the evidence, and frequently the evidence isn't there. Whether the ideas I'm describing lead to more or less government, I hope often less than any particular nation has, depends on the context. But you're clearly right that the burden that must be met is high for any kind of intervention, including nudges. And the only thing to underline is that the nudges are emphatically choice-preserving, like a GPS. So they're not withdrawing choice. If you have a default rule, it does not take choice away. People can opt out, and they not infrequently do.
So just on that point, I mean, we'll come back to this point just a moment. In the book, you give the example of Mayor Bloomberg and the banning of venti soft drinks in fast food outlets. Was that bad essentially because it removed the choice?
Well, what I'd say, there's a lot to be said about Mayor Bloomberg's idea about the big gulp.
Yeah.
First of all, it's not a nudge. That goes well beyond a nudge. It's not freedom preserving. Yeah. On one view, and this is my view, the analysis should depend on the costs and benefits. So people can't get certain drugs without a prescription. That's not a nudge, that's a ban. You can't just get the drug without a prescription. There are workplaces that some workers would volunteer to work in, but the government doesn't allow it because it's unsafe. Yeah. That's beyond a nudge. Yeah. So the Bloomberg view, I would say, should be, the proposal should be assessed in terms of costs and benefits, meaning what are the adverse effects on consumers and others of the ban, and what are the safety, the health benefits of the ban. And probably, once we did the analysis, we'd conclude that the costs aren't very high and the benefits aren't very high either. So reasonable people can be in favor mildly or against mildly. And that's how the assessment would go. On something where the intrusion on the private sphere is not more aggressive than the Bloomberg intrusive. It's not nothing, but it's not that intrusive. The idea of getting all up in arms about it rather than being negative seems a little overreaction. Of the bad things government does, that wouldn't be in the top 10 list.
Unless you're Glenn Beck.
Maybe Glenn Beck was exercised about that, but there are other things to be more exercised about. The question?
Yeah, so this point is about a number of private commercial organisations and others are deploying nudge-style techniques. Now, is there a role here for some sort of public intervention to maybe not regulate, but maybe shine a light on how those techniques are being deployed?
Okay, in free societies that prize individual liberty and economic growth, to allow private organizations to do a lot of stuff seems to me the good presumption. And if some private organizations are saying, we're going to have a default rule of this kind on our credit cards and others a different kind of default rule, the presumption, let 1,000 flowers bloom, let 1,000,000 flowers bloom. If the market isn't competitive or if there's some market failure, then there's a discussion to be had. The idea of regulating social media providers is on free speech and other grounds not exciting. And so you'd have to have a very, very powerful reason. If there's fraud, that's another matter.
But there's no doubt, I mean, obviously fast food manufacturers are the sort of villains of the piece, as often the case, but they're deploying techniques that that induce you to consume more than you would otherwise do if you were really thinking about the consequences in a balanced way. Now, there is a sort of public health argument, which, interestingly, going back to the first question, leaning on the harm principle, you would be very tempted to make an intervention. But on the paternalistic front, would you be equally willing to make that sort of intervention?
Okay, so the question is, if fast food restaurants are creating a problem, what is the kind of problem that they're creating? One possibility is that they're producing illness that harms other people. Now, it's not like smoking, where if my neighbor eats a lot, that's going to make me sick directly. No. It would have to be something like it has an indirect effect on the health system. And as noted, the appropriate response to that is a corrective tax. Now, we'd have to figure out what is the exact relationship between a unit of fast food consumption, and fast food isn't unique in having high caloric content, so that would be the question. And since slapping on additional taxes, that's not in difficult or even good economic times the most exciting thing to do. Want to be cautious about that. So that's the third-party effect route. The other route is the problem that fast food restaurants, the market failure, is a lack of sufficient information on the part of consumers. And there, the nudge approach would be information. And in the United States, our Affordable Care Act has a calorie labeling requirement. And it's good to be very systematic about the empirical effects of interventions of this sort. But in principle, calorie labeling is the right nudge if people aren't sufficiently informed. Now, there are some things done by the private sector, by the way, tribute to the private sector, which are clearer and simpler than calorie counts, which are numbers and maybe not that easy to compare. So some experiments have done with red light, not good, green light, good for you. And the early results have been very promising about that private sector disclosure strategy.
Great, thank you. Okay, let's open it up to another round of questions. I'm trying to get a bit more of a gender balance in this, but you're making it very difficult for me. How about this lady at the back here?
Hello. My name's Stella Kyriazis. I'd like to ask you a bit more about political voting. You spoke about trust, which I can understand, but if political parties have to make sure that the majority of people have to vote for them, surely the nudge is quite difficult, because a group of people in Group A, for example, might want a certain policy, whereas Group B want a different policy. So how does a political party go around making sure that they get the majority votes?
Okay, thank you. And then this lady here.
Hi, Eleanor Heather from the Wales Centre for Behaviour Change. It was kind of coming back to the 4 qualifiers you had of when you should have kind of default choice settings, and whether maybe there should be a kind of interventionist framework devised to avoid the risk of endogeneity within that choice determination. So whether the decision maker is a poor choice architect, but it's still the person deciding whether choice architecture should be used, and deciding whether these 4 qualifiers apply or don't.
Okay, so it's sort of gateways to it, yeah. And I think this gentleman here had a question as well.
Yes, it's a question from Twitter from Nick Branson, who asks, in reference to the Esther Duflo quote on poverty, what applications do you see for behavioral economics in the developing world?
Okay.
Okay, so the developing world is an area where there's a lot of thinking being done. The World Bank's 2015 report, which will be out this December, is on exactly that point. And the only thing I would underline in direct response right now reserving the rest for the report, is that the problem of cognitive scarcity is a systematically important one in the developing world, meaning that people have so much to think about that programs should be designed with that point very much in mind. So in a wealthy country where there's clean water, there's clean air, where there's easy access to doctors, where there's a banking system that functions, where you don't have to worry about crime all the time, the problem of cognitive scarcity is, for those reasons, among others, reduced. In a nation where those things are always on the table, programs that are cognitive taxes can be self-defeating. And that's something that maybe provides a path forward for programs that will be helpful. In the United States, we have a program to give school lunches and breakfast to poor kids. And a number of poor kids who are eligible haven't signed up. And the reason is that the families are dealing with a lot. Yeah. And to fill out relevant forms is a burden. And what happened in the United States was the relevant institutions know enough to know who's in the program. And so there's direct certification, which means that hundreds of thousands, probably millions of children are getting meals who otherwise wouldn't. I think this is like a little story that provides help for burden and paperwork and form filling and program redesign directions in developing nations. Okay, on the choice architects and the reasons why they might not want defaults and why they might want active choosing, it could be that a choice architect could think, this is an area where we, choice architects, just don't know enough about what's best for people. And I was privileged to be in government for a long period. And good government officials think to themselves not infrequently, we just don't know enough. And then one possible response to that question is to think, then we're going to ask people. We're not going to just make a decision based on imperfect knowledge. So choice architects often, private sector, public sector, can think we don't have enough knowledge to devise a default rule, so active choosing is the way to go. The medical area is a really interesting one for this, where there's a view of medical ethics, which is that there are default treatments that are best given the statistics. And the question is whether you say to the patient, here's the default, do you want to go with that or depart from it? Or instead, in which you say to the patients, here are 5 things, which do you like? And there's the latter is active choosing, the first is a version of default. And a lot would depend on, I think, the state of knowledge that the medical profession has. If one is clearly indicated and the others are, you'd have to be really quite an exotic person to choose one of the others, meaning your risk taste would have to be of a certain very unusual kind, then the default would seem better. One thing that's hard is for the choice architect to think, I as choice architect am biased. That's a psychologically hard state for a choice architect to have, in which case the democratic process, or maybe regulators controlling private sector biased people, would have to provide the good safeguard. In free societies, one constraint on biased choice architecture is transparency/democracy. So there's American Supreme Court Justice who said sunlight is the best of disinfectants. I think everyone interested in government policy should have that slogan at the tip of his or her tongue. Yeah. And in free markets, the safeguard is competition. So if we have a competitive system, at least the risk of biased choice architectures is diminished because they're going to go out of business.
So if we're interested in democratic engagement on that front, how do we go about increasing it?
Yes, so the question is that some nudges will split people across partisan lines. And then what's the path forward? Well, I think one thing just to notice is that nudges aren't more likely to split people, I don't think, along partisan lines than other policy instruments. In fact, they're less likely to split people across partisan lines because they're more choice preserving. So in the United States, whether you're a Democrat or Republican, the idea of automatic enrollment in a retirement plan is an attractive idea, and it was signed by the Bush administration. The notion of warnings for cigarettes or calorie labeling, if you were trying to catalog the things that split people along political lines, those would not be two that you think about. And I'm sure here that there's a large universe of nudge-type instruments that don't split people politically, that are just agreeable policy initiatives. Now, it is true that some nudges can split people along political lines. There can be nudges that are designed to promote one conception of social justice that people disagree about. And they're just as for criminal penalties or economic incentives or subsidies, democratic debate is right. And if there's a political division, well, let's have an election.
Okay. Right, let's have 2 quick-fire questions, and I've got a final question as well. So we've got 2 quick-fire questions. This lady here and this gentleman here. Make it as quick as you can. We've got about 3 or 4 minutes to get through this round.
In your last, when you were talking about, for example, going to hospital and having 4 options, I suddenly saw this awful image of us having, of it all going wrong, that we pay people to do a job, but that they really have given up on choice. So they're giving the choice to the people that they should be serving and nudging them probably in a completely wrong direction. So it's, do you want plaster cast on your arm, just a bandage, or just an elastoplast, or, well, actually, we've run out of plaster cast, so how about we just wash it and you go away? So you're nudging them in completely the wrong direction, so we could have an awful...
Really, really good question about ethics there.
Who nudges the nudger? Isn't it a two-way street? Could the civilian population be nudging the government the other way around?
There is that. And my question actually is related to that. Do we need to democratise nudging? Are you frustrated about the lack of popular knowledge there is about our cognitive biases and weaknesses? And should there not be a sort of public education programme so people could start to devise their own nudges to help themselves make better decisions?
Okay, great. So thank you for those 3. So in terms of nudges for nudges for nudgers, just like you want democratic control of those who impose criminal penalties or civil fines or who have subsidies or economic taxes, you want democratic control of all public officials. If they have weak instruments like information disclosure, still that should be subject to public control, and if they have strong ones like criminal penalties. So that's the constraint, the first-order constraint on government, and a government that knows it's subject to citizen control should think basically every moment, even if an election isn't coming up, we're here to serve people, and that's a great privilege. And that culture can help. And in markets, so too, you want well-functioning competition so that if a company starts nudging people in a direction that hurts them, we have an economic punishment that they will incur. In terms of doctors, it is a terrific question, and it's right at the heart of the theoretical issues here. So this is really where practice meets theory. Here are 2 different conceptions of what the medical profession is for and what they're being paid for. Conception number 1, they're paid to elicit, based on the expert knowledge they have, a menu of treatment options which then the patient chooses. And that, I think, is probably a widespread current view of what the medical profession is for. I take the burden of your question to be skeptical of that. And the skepticism might be right. It wouldn't be right because we're paying them to tell us, and this is the second conception, what the right treatment is. Because there are 2 conceptions of what we're paying them for. One is to give us a menu of options, the other is to give them the right treatment. I tend to think that a little framework based on the cost of decisions and the cost of errors is the right one to settle the choice between the 2 frameworks. That is, if we think that there are cases where the medical profession really knows based on the science what the right treatment is, to say this is the medically indicated option. I'll talk to you about some others if you want, but this is the one that we favor. That's good if the information stock justifies it. If the medical information is in a state of uncertainty and there are three things and reasonable people can differ, then the decision cost, error cost framework suggests let the patient have the three. I think sometimes doctors are maybe insufficiently appreciative of the fact that patients are scared, facing a high degree of stress, and not welcoming an influx of information that's nominally designed to promote their autonomy.
And finally, the broader conception, very, very briefly, do we all need to know more about our cognitive frailties so we can make better decisions?
The answer to that cannot be no.
Good. Okay, Why Nudge is available afterwards. It's an excellent book. It's one of those books you find yourself coming up with objections as you're going through it, and then they're always answered like 2 or 3 pages later. So I'd highly recommend it. Thank you very much for your contributions. Thank you for those who have tuned in, and thank you very much to Professor Sunstein for a wonderful presentation. Thank you.